Hey friends, we've been doing something a little bit different at Crosswalk this summer. Every week we're trying to replicate a little bit what the early church did, what the very first Christians did when they got together to worship. So every week we're getting together, we're having a meal together, we're having a lot less of a long sermon and a lot more of a just discussion and conversation time and fellowship time. Also been kind of incorporating things from different Christian traditions that might be a little foreign to some of us and bringing that into the mix, and it's been a lot of fun. And unfortunately, it's not very conducive to a live stream like we normally do with our services, so this is your substitute. I'm sorry, that's the best we got for you. Just kidding. What we want you to do, if you're watching this, is we want you to participate with us by proxy. So wherever you're at, we're putting in the description, you're going to see some discussion questions. I want to invite you to watch or listen to this, and then to take those questions, see if you can grab somebody to join with you, or if you absolutely can't, just do it between you and God, but go through those discussions and talk through those together, dig into God's Word together as we get together here and worship and fellowship and dig into God's Word together. I pray and I hope that you're doing the same wherever you're at if you're not able to join us in person. Well, each week of the summer, we're focusing on a different aspect of what the church is, what the church is all about. What is the purpose of church? What do we as the church do? And this week, we're focused on generosity. From the very beginning, from our roots as Christians, as followers of Jesus, generosity is in our DNA. It's in the very origins of this whole movement that we call Christianity today, that we call the mere thing of having faith in Jesus and following him and committing our lives to him. And so it's crucial. It's something that needs to be a part of our daily walk, our day-to-day lives. And so this goes all the way back. God has always cared about generosity, all the way from the beginning. We see throughout the Old Testament, you see different times in Genesis where Abraham or Isaac or Jacob in particular will show generosity, or they'll give, like Abraham giving tithing, giving 10% to Melchizedek. We see things like that happen. We see this desire to not so much to be financially dependent on others, but rather to have resources in order to bless others. We see that from early on in the Bible. We see in the time of Moses when God gathers the Israelites at Mount Sinai and gives them the law and makes the covenant with them, that part of that is this attitude of taking care of each other. We see commandments such as, if you're harvesting in your field and do you really need to get exactly the whole corner? Why don't you just leave a little corner? Why don't you leave a little section untouched as you're harvesting your grain, so that widows and orphans in the community or foreigners who don't have the family support and the built-in connections that come with being a local, whoever it might be, that they can come by and they can pick from that, right? That they can glean from you, right? We see this kind of pattern, just this idea that you own what you own, but you should be generous and you should help those in need when you can, right? That you should be responsible for other people. If you're responsible for finances, then you're responsible not just for how it affects you, you're responsible for other people. We see that throughout. And along with that, we see God establishing, in the book of Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy as well, God establishing this system involving the tabernacle and later the permanent structure known as the temple, where the idea is that you're going to have this whole tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel. You're going to have the Levites who are exclusively responsible for the temple. And within that tribe, descendants of Aaron are the priests in that temple. And the rest of Israel is supposed to support financially this one tribe to contribute to them, and that is what they're supposed to live on, so that their full-time work can be running and maintaining the temple. Because there's a lot of logistics to that. You got to think about, just basic setup and tear down is with the tabernacle as it's moving around. You got to think about maintenance. You got to think about offering the actual sacrifices like the priests do. That's animals, and that's grain, and that's incense, and other things like that, right? You got to think about security, right? You got to think about musicians. There are all these different functions within the temple, and hey, that's time consuming. Who has time to do all that if they have to work to support their family? Well, let's have all the other Israelites contribute. As Israelites come to the temple, to the tabernacle, what they're supposed to do is offer sacrifices. They're supposed to offer an animal or a grain offering or an incense offering or what have you. And whenever they do so, it's always supposed to be their first and their best, the absolute best that they have to offer to God. And what happens is they'll, for example, bring an animal, and the animal will be slaughtered. It'll be, the meat will be burned on the altar, but not like burned up. What happens is it's cooked on the altar, and then in other, in pagan societies, idol worshipers, other nations around them, other cultures, what they did? They cooked it on the altar as like an offering to the gods, and really believed they were feeding the gods, but then they would go and sell it, or the priests would eat it or something like that, and people would actually eat it. They'd have a barbecue, they'd go and cook this meat, this animal, but then people would eat it, right? And there was hypocrisy in that, sometimes in different practices, that they were pretending, no, the gods ate this, and really it was just people that ate it, right? But in God kind of takes that, but he adapts it, and he never says, hey, I need the food. You're not offering me the sacrifice because I'm hungry. I don't need it. You're offering it because it is necessary within our relationship for you to see your possessions as not belonging to you, but that everything you have is something I gave you. And as a recognition of that, of your trust and recognizing how much you depend on me, I want you to offer me your first and your best of everything that you have, right? And along with things, like, atonement for sin and other purposes with sacrifices, that was a big part of it. Of the fundamental idea is just, you need to recognize that you're dependent on me, God, to provide for you, and you need to trust me, and you need to demonstrate that trust by trusting me that when I say I want the first and the best of what you have, that you're not going to go hungry, that if you honor me, I'm going to take care of you, right? And so we see this theme throughout. We see an emphasis throughout the Old Testament on generosity, on providing for those in need. We see in the prophets a big concern for orphans and widows being neglected and abused, for just in general, wealthy and powerful people taking advantage of and harming poorer and more disadvantaged and needy people in a variety of ways. We see that throughout the Bible, that God does not take kindly to that. We see throughout the Bible this expectation that, generally speaking, if you see someone in need and you have the means to do something about it, you should do something about it, right? This is a recurring pattern throughout the Old Testament. It's not surprising then, by the time we get to the New Testament, Jesus has a lot to say about money. Actually, Jesus talks about money a lot. He says things about money that are pretty predictable and pretty expected, and he says things about money that are radical. So, for example, in Matthew 6, right, he says, when you give to the needy, not if you give, not, hey, you should give to the needy. He says, when you give to the needy, right? And it's just assumed that you're going to do this, that this is a thing you're supposed to do. And yeah, it was common. People did it. But he says, when you give to the needy, don't be like these people that are doing it for the attention. Don't do it so people will think you're awesome. Like, he says, don't even let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, right? He says, when you give to the needy, it should not be about you or making a platform for you or drawing attention to yourself. It should exclusively be about honoring God by loving this person and meeting that need for them. And it doesn't matter if you ever get any credit, because, hey, you know what? Your Heavenly Father sees what's done in secret, and He will reward you. So instead of settling for this mere, earthly praise that you'll get from people, settle for the fact that God thinks it was great that you did that. That is plenty. That's all the reward you need. And actually, your reward in heaven will be much better, right? Whatever that means on a specific level. He says things like, in Matthew 23, for example, where he's just criticizing a lot of the hypocrisy that you see in a lot of religious leaders at that time, and specifically the Pharisees that he's addressing there mainly. And one of the practices, they'll do things like they'll say, hey, the law says to give 10% to God of everything I have, so you know what I'm going to do? And by the way, the word tithe, if you've heard that word tithe, T-I-T-H-E, it just means a tenth. That's the origin of that word in English. So you might see that word in the Bible, you might have heard that in church. It means to give a tenth of what you have, right? So he's addressing these people who faithfully give 10% of everything they own, right? And down to such minute detail that they're thinking like, it's not just about money. For us today, it's mainly, most of us just we get a paycheck, right, for our work, and we convert that money into the goods and services to meet our needs, right? Back then, it's a lot more of less about money. Money is definitely there, but it's more about the tangible things, right? So you, even if you have monetary income, you probably grow some food that you eat. You probably own some animals, right, as a source of food or other things too, right, or transportation or what have you. So your life is a little more diversified in that sense. And so these people were saying, literally down to the point of, when I give God my 10%, I even include, I grow like some herbs and spices in my garden, and I give God a tenth of all of that. And they're like, wow, okay, what a big deal. And then at the same time, Jesus says, you have people doing that, and at the same time, you know what they're doing? Their parents are aging and need financial support, and they, and their parents need their help. And in that society, it's a really big deal that the head of the household, the firstborn especially, is responsible for the whole household, including their parents as they age and things like that. And Jesus says, you have people who are absolutely going out of their way to make sure even my little herb garden, even any little leaf of, if I get one leaf of mint, I'm going to chop off 10% of that and give it to God, right? But my parents are in need. And when they ask for money or they need some kind of help, I say, oh, I'm sorry, I would have given you some money, but actually that money was set aside for God, right? And he's not talking about like setting aside money for God, that's a bad thing, but like You'll go to that minute detail for a mint leaf, but your own parents are aging, are dying, and need financial support, and you won't lift a finger to help them, right? Jesus is highlighting the hypocrisy in that. Jesus has a whole lot else to say about money. He at one point he even says that, like, he uses money frequently as like a metaphor for other things, right? He'll tell a parable about two people that are forgiven a huge financial debt, right? One bigger than the other, and who's going to love God more, right? He uses parables like the parable of the talents, right? Where a talent being a unit of measure for a precious metal, right? And using that as an analogy for basically that which God has entrusted to you, that you should be faithful with it, including money, but beyond just money, right? So he uses money frequently. He talks about it a lot, and he uses it frequently as a metaphor. And the message is always the same: is, generally speaking, a few basic principles. You should always trust God to provide for you, right? Jesus, like he says in Matthew chapter 6, he says, look at the birds. Do the birds have a bank account? Do they have a savings account? Do they have a 401k? No, but God provides for them. I'm not saying you shouldn't have those things. I work in a bank, right? But he says you shouldn't put all, you don't need to worry. You don't need to worry. This anxiety about what's going to happen to me, and seeing money as the answer to that. He says that is so unhealthy. That is so against the way God designed us to live. All you need to do is just trust God. You know what? You don't see birds storing away in barns, and guess what? They always have enough food. They're fine, right? And Jesus is just making the point that we can trust God to provide for us. He makes a point in that same section that like, who among you, if you're a father, right, and your kid asks for food, you're going to give him a snake, right, or a rock or something like that? No, that's ridiculous. Even the worst dad in the world wouldn't do that, except maybe as a joke. You know how to take care of your kids. You know how to give good gifts to them. Why don't you think God would do the same for you? So number one is we need to trust God, that God can provide for us. That's a recurring principle we see. Number two is we need to be generous. We need to see the resources we have not as, this is for me, this is for my financial security, this is to make me feel better about things, this is to give me comforts and luxuries. No. The purpose of the resources you have are so that you can serve God and so that you can serve other people. That when you see people in need, your instinct should be to help them, right? And that along with that, a lot of why we don't do that is because we think, well, I don't have enough. And Jesus emphasizes again that whole point of trusting God, right? There's this moment, for example, where Jesus is in the temple and he sees people coming and bringing their offerings to God. And he sees some people are bringing large amounts of money. And then there's this widow that comes along and all she has is 2 little coins and she puts them in there anyway. And Jesus says, that woman gave more than everybody else combined. Why? Because that's all everybody else, they gave a lot, but they gave out of their abundance. They gave what they didn't need, right? They're going to be just fine. Even though they gave a lot, they had a lot that they could give before it's going to hurt them, right? She gave everything she had, even if it wasn't much. To her, it was everything, right? So there's this emphasis that your generosity should not be hindered by a fear, by an anxiety that you're not going to have enough. Should you be responsible? Yeah. I mean, like if you got a family to support and you're like giving all of every paycheck to the first person you see on the street asking for money or something like that, I mean, there's a time and a place where that's not a bad thing to do, but there's a time and a place where that's not a very responsible thing to do. That, good for you for loving the stranger, but why don't you love your own family? There's an argument to be made on both sides, but the point stands. The general idea of it is you should not hesitate to give out of a sense of fear, out of a sense of generosity, or out of greed, out of a desire to have more for yourself. You should be generous and see what you have not as for the purpose of serving you, but for the purpose of serving others. Right? And the third thing, and this goes right along with it, is Jesus had a lot to say about greed. He had a lot to say about greed. There's this one time this rich young ruler comes to him, and this is a guy with wealth and authority and power and at a young age too. And he comes to Jesus and he says, basically, what does it take? What does God want from me? And Jesus says, well, You know the law, you like, and he quotes some of the 10 Commandments, and the rich young ruler says, yeah, I know. I've kept all those since I was young, since I was a kid. Like, yep, I know that. And Jesus is like, okay, you want to know like what's next? You want to know the next step for you? You've got a lot of resources. I want you to sell everything you own, give all the money to the poor, and then come follow me. Not just do that. I want you to do that and then come follow me. And the rich young ruler, we don't know what he ultimately does, but the young man goes away sad because he was wealthy. And that would be a lot for him to give up for Jesus. And Jesus tells his disciples in that moment, he says, I tell you what, it is easier to get a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a wealthy person to enter the kingdom. Which is a scary statement, and people have, by the way, you might have heard something about like the eye of a needle being this gate in Jerusalem, or like this really short gate. If you've heard that, that's not true. That's actually kind of an urban legend. But if you haven't heard that, just pretend it didn't happen. But he's saying, you think about the eye of a needle, he means the eye of a needle, the little hole where you put the thread in a needle, that small, and a camel, that big. He's saying it would be easier to fit a camel through that little hole than for a wealthy person to enter the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus' own disciples in that moment say, like, well, then who can be saved, right? Like, man, what hope is there for anybody, right? And the lesson here is, again, it comes back to a dependence on God. Jesus says, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible, right? That it's not about me and what I can accomplish. It is about my trust and reliance on God. So Jesus wants us to trust God with our resources, with our money. Jesus wants us to be generous. And Jesus wants us to not be attached to wealth, to not be attached to not think this is what's going to solve my problems, this is what's going to make me happy, this is what's going to bring purpose and meaning to my life. This is, that's making money your God, right? That's making comfort or pleasure or happiness your God. That's making, your anxiety that makes you worry about the future and the only solution is to have money. You're making anxiety your God. And your only God should be God. So trust God, be generous, and don't be greedy. Don't be attached to that money. Don't give it undue importance. It's necessary. It's part of life. Like my body doesn't always work the way I want it to, but you know what? I'm stuck with it. And I need to make the most of it, and I need to be responsible with it. At the end of the day, the most important thing is not so much the shape my body is in, because it's going to die someday anyway, but someday I'm going to live forever with Jesus, and it won't matter, right? In the same way with our money, like there's going to come a time where it's just not going to matter anymore. What's done is done, and who cares? It's irrelevant at this point. But in the meantime, let's be smart with that. And being smart with it doesn't mean being selfish with it. It means trusting God. It means being generous, and it means not holding onto it with a tight fist, right? And we see this pattern, this expectation of generosity play out over the years, over the past 2,000 years. I mean, after Jesus, he dies on the cross, he's raised from the dead, he ascends into heaven, and before he does, he sends his followers out to take what he started and spread it throughout the world, and they do so, and we see them going out and about. Generosity is just baked into what they do, right? You see, I mean, they're still, in the early days, these Jewish Christians, they're still involved in the temple, they're still bringing offerings to the temple and all that, right? As they go, they start forming this community where anytime somebody in the Christian family and in the local church family has any kind of need, people are just stepping up and contributing to it. You even have people selling off real estate for money to give to other people in the church family to take care of them and look out for. We actually see some of the first issues in the early church that they dealt with were things like, insincerity, where somebody's lying, they're trying to make themselves look good by their giving, but they're not being honest about what they're doing. They're lying to God and lying to everybody else so that they'll look good, right? You have people, concerns where like, hey, we're collecting money to take care of like the widows, who just in that society don't have a lot of options financially and to make a living. And so, we're trying to take care of the widows in our Christian community, and some of them are getting overlooked, and there's some racial things there, right? We see those are some of the first tensions. We see over and over, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, if you've spent a lot of time reading the Bible, if you've spent if you've spent time reading Paul's letters, something that might be easy to overlook is those especially at those last chapters where he's like greeting specific people. You'll also find over and over that everywhere Paul goes, he's collecting money. He's very often appealing to, as he's writing letters to these Christians, to churches that he started, he's asking them for money. He says, hey, next time I come, or so-and-so's on their way, I want you to take up an offering, and we're going to take it to the folks over here. And he's raising money from them to support each other when they have needs, right? We see this kind of thing over and over in the book of Acts and throughout the New Testament letters. We see this emphasis on generosity. We see this thing start to happen where you have people like the apostles, like Paul, and like others who kind of have made it their full-time job to travel around telling people about Jesus and starting new church communities wherever they go. As they do so, that the people that they're going and reaching for Jesus are like immediately turning around and supporting the mission, that they're funding this kind of thing, that they're living with people who are generously letting them live in their homes, that they're just all around being financially supported. Sometimes even if they're married and traveling around, who knows, maybe some of them had kids by this point, that they're bringing in tow as they go around the world telling people about Jesus, that wherever they go, they're being supported financially by the Christians who are already there, or sometimes by people who are just became Christians, like they just heard the message and they're like, yeah, I want to follow Jesus. And then like right away, they're like, hey, come stay at my house. And they're taking care of people, right? And so we see this start to develop, and we have other early writings like this guy named Justin Martyr who talked about, a couple centuries later, wrote about what it was like in the early Christian worship, in that he was a part of. And one of the things he mentions is that every week when they gather to worship, they take up an offering, and that money is then distributed to those in their community who are in need. And we see this over time, developing of norms and different practices and traditions around it over the past couple thousand years. That there's been this focus on generosity within Christianity, but very often it's centralized, which is just, it's one approach to it. You can give money generously to whoever you want to. We can also pool our money together, and somebody can be responsible for making sure it's used wisely. There's ways to do that, but we see different ways start to develop. We see the rise of Christians invented the orphanage, invented the hospital, invented the public school, things like that, where we can all contribute our resources to help those who don't have this particular thing on their own. We can create a way, like we can generously provide for them. We see it become institutionalized, where you'll say, here's kind of the overall church leadership, and so everybody bring your donations, bring your generous contributions, and let's pull them all together, and it's going to support everything we do as a church. And maybe we start to see after the earliest that we have archaeological evidence of a church building is at least a couple hundred years after the time that Jesus was on earth, right? And it may have been earlier, we just don't have evidence for it. Before that, it seems like they generally met in people's homes, or just whatever space they could maybe rent. But over time, it becomes more and more normal for churches to have a building, right? And we get to the 21st century, and well, now we got to have heat and AC, right? And we got to have electricity, and it's just the expectations are raised there. Well, okay, that stuff costs money. Oh, we got to have indoor plumbing. We got to have toilet paper. And I'm all for having those things. I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm just describing what's there, and I'm perfectly in favor of us having indoor plumbing and toilet paper in a church building. I think we should consider that the bare minimum here, along with a roof over our head. Right, but you see the money being used in different ways, and in facilities, and providing buildings and spaces that we can use for different ministry functions. Over church history, we've seen money being used to support different Christian causes, different missions. Maybe there's somebody who's going to travel to another part of the world, and they're going to serve people there. Maybe they'll meet physical needs. Maybe they'll just share the message of Jesus. Maybe they'll start a church or what have you, right? And Christians around here, we're going to support them. We're going to raise some money and support them in what they do, right? We see various ways that Christians over the years have found to be generous, and just as we do local ministry and the costs that just inherently come with that, we all just kind of pool our money together, pool our resources, and that money's used in a variety of ways. All that to say, there's a lot of ways to carry this out. There's a lot of ways for us as a church to carry this out. There's a lot of ways for us as individuals to carry this out. Kendra and I, we contribute money to Crosswalk regularly. We also have other causes that we contribute to. So, we have through Compassion International, we have a couple of kids in faraway places that we've never been in person, but we provide funds that help meet some basic needs for them, and also some education about Jesus. Right? There's another local church that we support financially, a little bit. We're not rolling in the money. I work in a bank, but bankers don't make as much money as you think. But we contribute what we can, right? When a need arises, somebody's in need, we try to help out when we can. We do the best we can with what we have, and certainly we could do better. And honestly, if I'm thinking about a growth area for me, what I could do a lot better at is there are things I could spend less money on that would free up resources for us to be more generous with that same money. We all have room to grow. We all have somewhere to go with this, and there's a variety of ways to live this out. Now, I want to give a couple pieces of advice. If you're new to this, if you're a relatively new Christian, or like you've never really given to a church, at least not with any regularity, or maybe you've tried to help people out here or there, but you're not doing anything consistent, I want to challenge you to do something consistent in terms of generosity. So an easy way to do that, give money to your local church, give money to Crosswalk here, right? We have a variety of ways to do that to make it convenient. You can text it. You can do it online. At the end of this video, we're going to put up a little visual that shows different ways you can give to Crosswalk if you want to. If you feel led to, please do. There are other causes that you could support, either on a one-time or a consistent basis. But I want to challenge you, if this is something you haven't done yet, I want to challenge you to make generosity a consistent thing in some form. And that could be contributing to a local church, especially, hey, if you're part of a local church, somebody's paying the light bills. If you're coming in and using the lights, you should be helping to contribute to that if you can, right? To the extent you can. Everybody has a different level of income, and some people can contribute more than others, and that's fine. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. So if you don't have any kind of consistency with that, try to have some consistency. Right? And maybe it's a different thing every week. Kendra and I had this thing for a while where, as part of we set a budget that, we had money that we were just going to be every week or every month, we were just going to be generous with this amount of money. And very often the form that took was just, we'd go to a restaurant. Back before we had kids, we would go on dates regularly, and we would eat out. And there'd be a server, right, that'd be helping us. And very often they don't get very good tips. And unfortunately for people who have worked in restaurants as servers and worked on tips, there's a reputation that Sunday after church is the worst time to work because Christians are bad tippers. And that's not always true, but there's a reputation there. And anyway, so we always tried to, we wanted to be generous. So we would just have money every week and every month that was just cash that we could use for whatever generous purpose we might happen to find at that particular time. And usually that was just giving an absurd tip to a waitress or a waiter, right? And that's one cool thing to do. That's not the only way, right? There's different ways you can set up regular giving that just kind of goes on behind the scenes, and you don't have to think about it, and it's automatic. You can set apart cash every week and say, what are we going to give it to? I don't know. We'll just see what God puts in front of us one way or another. All this to say, I want to say, if this is a new thing to you, I want to ask you in your walk with Jesus, find a way to make generosity a consistent thing, a planned thing, and not just if I think about it and it doesn't hurt too much at the time thing. Make it a consistent thing. But number two, if you've been doing this for a while, I want to challenge you to challenge yourself, to think outside the box a little bit. Maybe you're a consistent giver at church, and that's awesome. Maybe there's a little bit more that you could be setting aside for your church or for some other cause. Maybe there's something more you could be doing. Maybe there's somewhere you could cut back so that you could be more generous. Maybe there's a variety of ways to go about this. And from a financial perspective, there are a lot of ways that that you can strategize, especially if you're planning for your retirement, if you're planning for after your death, doing some estate planning, which is something that everybody should do. Think about generosity, incorporate generosity into that. Not just about what's best for me, not just about what will I leave behind for my kids someday. Hopefully you're at least thinking about that. But beyond that, what are you going to do that's going to make an impact with that, right? The bigger the dollar amount we're talking, the bigger the potential impact. So let's think about that, right? But if, let's just say you're giving consistently in church, right? And you've faithfully been giving 10%, right? Because in your mind, tithing 10%, that's just what you're supposed to do. That's awesome. And I want to thank you and honor and praise that and encourage that. That is a great thing to do. What I want to ask you to do, though, is I want you to, I don't have a specific thing for this so much as just I want you to be open to the possibility that maybe in the near future, God is going to put an opportunity in front of you to bless somebody. And it's going to be more than what you're used to. It's going to be more than what you normally would do. Maybe it's going to be spontaneous, or maybe you're going to have a lot of time to think and prepare about it. And maybe it's going to be something that stretches you a little bit. That you have to make some kind of sacrifice. That it's not just, you get into your normal giving routines and at some point it doesn't feel like you're doing much. But I want to challenge you to when that opportunity comes, and I don't know what it'll be, what that'll look like, just to be obedient to the Spirit, to be obedient to what God is leading you to do, and to be open to the possibility that maybe God put this need in front of you for a reason. And just allow yourself to be stretched out of your comfort zone a little bit. That's where growth happens. Growth happens when we're pushed out of our comfort zone, not when we're sitting still doing the same thing, but when we're stretched. And so there's going to come a time, maybe it's soon, maybe it's far off in the future, there's going to come a time where there's an opportunity for you to be stretched in this particular area of your walk with Jesus. And I want to challenge you to trust God more with that. Wherever you're at, if you want to follow Jesus, generosity with your resources is fundamental to that. There's just no way around it. There's just too much stuff about money in the Bible. And money is so integral to our lives, it's not surprising that it's such a recurring thing in the Bible that we see. But I just want to challenge you, and I want to encourage you that, again, this is something I've found to be true in my own life, and this is a recurring message throughout the Bible, is that when we trust God with our resources, God will take care of us and we'll be fine. When we trust God, it's because we can trust Him. And He will come through and He will take care of us and we'll be okay. I'm not saying everything in life will be easy and there will never be challenges and there will be never be pain. Nobody ever promised that, by the way. The Bible never says your life should be easy and without any issues. Never says that. It takes for granted that that's just part of the broken world that we live in. But someday God's going to do something about that and God's going to fix the world. In the meantime, on this side of eternity, where we're at in our day-to-day lives, you will have difficulties, you will have challenges, and you will have opportunities to trust God with your resources. Trust Him with them. Don't be so attached to it, tight-fisted. Don't rely on money. Don't make money your God, like money's going to make you happy. Money's going to solve your problems. God is the solution to your problems. Trusting in God more is the solution to your problems. And by the way, it's going to lead to a happier life too. That's not really what it's about, but that's a byproduct that's going to come with it. Life with Jesus is better than life without Jesus. But trust God. Don't be tight-fisted. Be open-handed with your resources and trust that God is going to take care of you and your loved ones. Trust that God is going to provide opportunities and provide the means for you to serve and to bless others and to be His agent and to be a source of His generosity, a conduit of His generosity to others. And be open when you see someone in need to being a part of meeting that need. You might be an answer to prayer for that person. Let me pray. Speaking of prayer, let me pray for you now. Heavenly Father, I just pray that you would open us up, that you would warm our hearts and fill us with, God, just with a generous attitude, a generous spirit, that we would not be so attached to our resources, that we would not be trusting in them or relying on them for our happiness or our security, God, but that we would trust you to be our God and you alone. God, that we would be eager and enthusiastic to share our resources generously with others and to be your means of meeting the needs of other people and answering prayers. Lord, I pray that you would show us that you're trying to grow us and stretch us and help us to know you more and to be more like Jesus in this area. God, I just pray that you would reveal that to us, to everybody watching and to listening and to myself too, Lord. I pray that you would reveal that to us, that you would challenge and encourage us and lead us in the direction you want to lead us. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.